The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Chicago courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The air inside was heavy with anticipation, a mix of nervous energy and quiet murmurs filling the room. It was another day in the life of Judge Harold Miller, a man known for his stern demeanor and sharp tongue. He sat at his bench, shuffling papers and occasionally glancing at the clock. Today's case had drawn more attention than usual, not because of its complexity but because of one person standing in the courtroom, Kai Trump. Kai Trump wasn't what most people expected when they heard the name. She was young, barely in her late 20s, with soft features that made her seem almost out of place in the formal setting of a courtroom. Her dark hair was tied neatly into a bun, and she wore a simple navy blue suit that did little to mask her slender frame. To anyone watching, she looked like someone who might still be studying law rather than practicing it. And yet, there she was, standing confidently, or perhaps nervously, at the defense table, ready to represent her client, Emily Dawson. Emily Dawson, a woman in her early 40s, sat beside Kai, her hands clasped tightly together. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted around the room as if searching for some sign of hope. Emily had been accused of embezzling a significant amount of money from her employer, a well-known tech company called Innovatech. The charges were serious and the stakes were high. If convicted, Emily faced years in prison and the destruction of her reputation. For now, all she could do was trust the young lawyer sitting next to her. On the other side of the aisle stood Brian Carter, the prosecutor assigned to the case. Brian was everything Kai wasn't: tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His tailored suit and crisp tie gave him the appearance of someone who had spent years perfecting his craft. And he had. With over a decade of experience under his belt, Brian was used to winning. He glanced at Kai briefly, a smirk playing on his lips before turning his attention back to the judge. Judge Harold Miller cleared his throat loudly, silencing the murmurs in the courtroom. "Let's get started," he said gruffly, adjusting his glasses. "Counselor Carter, are you ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Brian replied smoothly, stepping forward. His voice carried authority, commanding attention without effort. "And Ms. Trump?" the judge asked, raising an eyebrow as he turned his gaze toward Kai. There was a hint of amusement in his tone, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Kai stood up slowly, smoothing her skirt before addressing the judge. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready." Judge Miller studied her for a moment, taking in her youthful appearance. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, aren't you a sight for sore eyes? You sure you're old enough to be here, Counselor?" A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery. Some spectators exchanged amused glances, while others leaned forward, curious to see how Kai would respond. Even Brian allowed himself a small smile, though he quickly composed himself. Kai didn't flinch. Instead, she offered the judge a polite smile. "Thank you for your concern, Your Honor. I assure you I am fully qualified to represent my client." The judge raised his eyebrows but didn't press further. "All right then. Let's move on. Prosecutor, give us your opening statement." Brian stepped up to the podium, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He began by outlining the prosecution's case against Emily Dawson. According to him, Emily had exploited her position as the chief financial officer of Innovatech to funnel millions of dollars into offshore accounts. He described a trail of fraudulent transactions, forged documents, and suspicious emails, all pointing directly to Emily. As he spoke, he gestured dramatically, driving home each point with practiced precision. When Brian finished, the courtroom felt heavier, as though the weight of his words had settled over everyone present. Judge Miller nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by the prosecutor's presentation. Then he turned to Kai. "Your turn, Counselor." Kai approached the podium, her steps steady despite the tension in the room. She took a deep breath, letting her eyes scan the jurors briefly before beginning. Her voice was calm and measured, devoid of any theatrics. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you've just heard is a story, not the truth." Her Words caught the judge's attention. He leaned back slightly, intrigued by her boldness. The gallery fell silent, every eye fixed on the young lawyer. Fraud cases like this one often rely on circumstantial evidence, Kai continued. Documents can be manipulated, emails can be forged, witnesses can lie. What matters is context, the bigger picture. She paused, letting her words sink in. My client, Emily Dawson, is innocent. Over the course of this trial, I will prove that she is a victim of manipulation, not the perpetrator. Judge Miller tilted his head, studying her closely. That's quite a claim, Ms. Trump. Do you have the evidence to back it up? Kai met his gaze without hesitation. I do, Your Honor, and I look forward to presenting it. For a fleeting moment, the judge seemed genuinely interested, but just as quickly, his skepticism returned. We'll see about that, he muttered, scribbling something on his notepad. As Kai returned to her seat, Emily whispered, Thank you. Her voice trembled with gratitude and relief. Kai gave her a reassuring nod, though inwardly, she knew, the hardest part was yet to come. The first witness called to the stand was David Meyer, a senior auditor from Innovatech. Brian questioned him extensively, highlighting discrepancies in the company's financial records that allegedly implicated Emily. David's testimony painted a damning picture, leaving many in the courtroom convinced of Emily's guilt. But when it was Kai's turn to cross-examine, she revealed a different side entirely. With careful questions, she guided David to admit that the company's accounting system had vulnerabilities, weaknesses that could easily be exploited by someone with insider knowledge. She also pointed out that David himself had flagged these issues months earlier, but was ignored by upper management. By the time the session ended for the day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted slightly. While Brian remained confident, there was a flicker of doubt in the jurors' expressions. Judge Miller, too, seemed less dismissive of Kai than he had been at the start. As Kai packed up her files, Emily touched her arm gently. You were amazing today, she said softly. I don't know how to thank you. Kai smiled faintly. We're not done yet, but we're off to a good start. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager to catch a glimpse of the unlikely hero of the trial. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward Kai, but she declined to comment, preferring to keep her focus on the task ahead. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had faced ridicule, skepticism, and hostility, and survived. But she knew the real battle was only beginning. Back in her office later that evening, Kai reviewed the day's events. She replayed key moments in her mind, analyzing what worked and what didn't. There were challenges ahead, no doubt, but she was determined to see this through, for Emily's sake, and for her own. Little did Kai know the surprises were far from over. Each piece of evidence, each witness, and each twist in the case would test her skills and resolve. Yet amidst the chaos, one thing was certain. Kai Trump was not someone to underestimate. The third day of the trial began with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and spectators, but also employees from Innovatech who had come to see how the case would unfold. Judge Harold Miller entered the room, his expression stern as usual, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He glanced at Kai Trump briefly before addressing the room. Let's get started, he said gruffly, signaling for Kai to call her first witness. Kai stood up calmly, smoothing her suit jacket as she approached the podium. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, knowing it could be the turning point in the trial. Your Honor, the defense calls Ryan Bennett back to the stand, she announced, her voice steady. Ryan retook the stand, looking even more nervous than before. Kai gave him a reassuring smile as she began her questioning. Mr. Bennett, yesterday you mentioned metadata logs that showed edits to key financial files. Can you explain what those logs revealed? Ryan cleared his throat, clutching the edge of the witness box. Yes. The logs showed that certain entries were altered after they were initially recorded. These changes made it look like Emily Dawson approved transactions that hadn't been authorized. Kai nodded encouragingly, And whose login credentials were used to make these changes? Laura Hayes's, Ryan replied, his voice trembling slightly. Her username appeared in the system logs every time the files were accessed or modified. Kai turned toward the jury, letting Ryan's words sink in. So, according to the logs, Laura Hayes was directly involved in altering the records? Yes, Ryan said firmly. It wasn't Emily. It was someone else trying to frame her. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Brian Carter shifted, uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tide beginning to turn. Judge Miller leaned forward, his interest piqued. Ms. Trump, he interjected, are you suggesting deliberate tampering of evidence? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Your Honor, Kai replied confidently. And it gets worse. She turned back to Ryan. Mr. Bennett, did you find any other suspicious activity in the company's systems? Ryan hesitated, glancing nervously at Laura Hayes, who sat stiffly in the gallery. Finally, he spoke. Yes, there were dummy accounts set up to funnel money out of the company. They weren't linked to Emily's name, but to aliases controlled by upper management. Kai raised an eyebrow. Upper management, including Ms. Hayes? Ryan nodded. Yes, Brian Carter objected immediately. Your Honor, this is hearsay. Mr. Bennett has no proof of direct involvement. Judge Miller considered the objection for a moment before ruling. Overruled. The witness may continue. Kai thanked the judge and pressed on. Mr. Bennett, how long have you known about these dummy accounts? For months, Ryan admitted, but I didn't know what to do. I thought if I said anything, I'd lose my job. Or worse. Kai nodded sympathetically. Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Bennett. No further questions. As Ryan left the stand, Kai felt a surge of confidence. She had planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors, but she knew she needed more concrete evidence to solidify her case. She returned to her seat, whispering briefly to Emily, who looked both hopeful and anxious. Next, Kai called another unexpected witness. Sarah Collins, a former IT specialist at Innovatech. Sarah entered the courtroom quietly, her hands clasped tightly together. She took the oath and sat down, her eyes darting around the room nervously. Kai approached the podium, her tone gentle yet firm. Ms. Collins, can you tell us about your role at Innovatech? Sarah nodded. I worked in the IT department, maintaining the company's servers and troubleshooting technical issues. Kai smiled encouragingly. During your time there, did you notice anything unusual about the company's systems? Sarah hesitated, clearly conflicted. Finally, she sighed. Yes. Someone kept accessing restricted areas of the network without authorization. At first I thought it might be a security breach, but then I realized it was coming from inside the company. Inside? Kai prompted. Can you elaborate? It was Laura Hayes, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was using admin privileges to alter financial records. When I confronted her, she threatened me, saying I'd regret it if I told anyone. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Even Judge Miller looked startled, banging his gavel to restore order. Ms. Trump, he warned, this is serious. Do you have proof to support these claims? Kai nodded. I do, Your Honor. She turned to Sarah. Ms. Collins, did you document any of this activity? Yes, Sarah replied, pulling a flash drive from her pocket. I saved copies of the server logs showing unauthorized access. I also recorded timestamps and user IDs. Kai accepted the flash drive and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Your Honor, I request permission to submit this as evidence. Judge Miller examined the contents of the flash drive carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. After a moment, he nodded. Admitted into evidence. Brian Carter stood up, visibly agitated. Your Honor, this is circumstantial at best. We need expert analysis to confirm its authenticity. Granted, Judge Miller replied. Both sides will have access to the data for review. Kai returned to her seat, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She had taken a risk calling Sarah to the stand. But the gamble had paid off. The evidence was compelling, and the prosecution now had to scramble to counter it. Later that afternoon, Kai presented additional documentation to bolster her case. She introduced emails between Laura Hayes and external consultants discussing offshore accounts, as well as bank statements showing large sums of money being transferred to shell companies. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of corruption within Innovatech and exonerated Emily Dawson. As the session drew to a close, Judge Miller addressed the court. "This has been a long day and we've heard some troubling testimony. Counselors, I expect both sides to prepare thoroughly for tomorrow's proceedings. Court is adjourned." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Kai once again, eager for comments. She declined to speak, keeping her focus on the task ahead. Back in her office, she reviewed the day's developments, her mind racing with possibilities. The trial was far from over, but she could feel the momentum shifting in her favor. Emily visited Kai later that evening, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You're giving me my life back." Kai placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "We're not done yet, but we're closer to the truth than ever before." As Kai prepared for the next day, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she'd come. What had started as a seemingly hopeless case was turning into something extraordinary. Every challenge, every obstacle, had pushed her to dig deeper and fight harder. And while the final verdict remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Kai Trump was proving herself to be not just a lawyer but a true advocate for justice. The fourth day of the trial began with a palpable tension in the air. The courtroom was packed once again, with reporters scribbling notes and spectators whispering among themselves. Judge Harold Miller entered the room, his expression unreadable as he took his seat. He glanced at both sides of the courtroom before addressing the room. "Let's proceed," he said firmly, signaling for Brian Carter to begin. Brian stood up, his confidence wavering slightly, but still evident in his posture. He had spent the night strategizing, determined to regain control of the narrative. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Laura Hayes back to the stand," he announced, his voice steady despite the pressure mounting against him. Laura Hayes walked to the witness box with forced composure, her face pale but her jaw set. She took the oath once again, her hands gripping the edge of the stand tightly. Brian approached her cautiously, aware that this testimony could either salvage his case or destroy it completely. "Ms. Hayes," Brian began, his tone calm but insistent. "Yesterday we heard allegations about your involvement in altering financial records. Can you explain these claims?" Laura straightened in her seat, her voice firm despite the tension radiating from her. "These accusations are baseless. I have no idea how my login credentials were used to access those files. Someone must have stolen them." Brian nodded sympathetically. "So you're saying you were unaware of any unauthorized activity involving your account?" "Yes," Laura replied. "I would never engage in embezzlement or tamper with company records. My focus has always been on protecting Innovatech's interests." Brian turned toward the jury, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's important to remember that evidence can be manipulated. Just because someone claims to have found suspicious activity doesn't mean Ms. Hayes is guilty." He turned back to Laura. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. No further questions." Kai Trump stood up slowly, her movements deliberate as she approached the podium. She fixed Laura with a steady gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "Ms. Hayes," she began, her voice soft yet commanding. "You claim someone stole your login credentials. Is that correct?" "Yes," Laura answered sharply. "I already told you that." Kai nodded thoughtfully. "Then why didn't you report this alleged theft to IT or management? Surely if someone compromised your account, it would be a major security concern." Laura hesitated, her confidence faltering slightly. I assumed it was a minor issue. I didn't think it warranted immediate attention." Kai raised an eyebrow. "A minor issue? Unauthorized access to sensitive financial records isn't something most people would consider minor. Wouldn't you agree?" Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I suppose so." "And yet," Kai continued, "you did nothing to investigate or address the problem." Isn't it strange that someone supposedly stole your credentials but you made no effort to stop them, or even notify anyone? I didn't know what to do, Laura snapped, her composure slipping further. It's not like I'm an expert in cybersecurity. Kai leaned slightly on the podium, her tone remaining polite but probing. Fair enough. But let's talk about the emails we introduced yesterday, the ones between you and external consultants discussing offshore accounts. How do you explain those? Laura's face flushed with anger. Those emails were taken out of context. They don't prove anything. Don't they? Kai countered gently. They clearly reference large sums of money being transferred to shell companies, and those transfers align perfectly with the timeline of the alleged embezzlement. Coincidence? That's ridiculous, Laura shot back. I was merely following instructions from senior management. Kai tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. Instructions from senior management? Can you name who gave you those instructions? Laura hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I can't recall exactly. It was a group decision. A group decision, Kai repeated, letting the skepticism hang in the air. And none of these supposed group members have come forward to corroborate your story. Isn't that convenient? Laura clenched her fists, her frustration boiling. Over. This is all a smear campaign against me. Judge Miller banged his gavel sharply. Order, he barked, glaring at Laura. Ms. Hayes, please refrain from making accusations without evidence. Kai held up her hands in a gesture of peace. No further questions, Your Honor. As Laura stepped down from the stand, her composure shattered. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Even Brian Carter looked uneasy, realizing that his star witness had crumbled under Kai's relentless questioning. Judge Miller scribbled something on his notepad, his expression unreadable. Later that afternoon, Kai presented her closing arguments for the defense. She approached the podium, her movements calm and deliberate. The room fell silent as she began speaking, her voice steady and clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she started. What we've seen over the past few days is not just a case of alleged embezzlement. It's a story of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. Emily Dawson, my client, has been framed by someone who wanted to cover their own tracks and shift the blame onto an innocent person. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The evidence speaks for itself. Metadata logs show unauthorized edits traced back to Laura Hayes' login credentials. Emails reveal discussions about offshore accounts linked directly to her. Witnesses have testified to seeing her alter records and threaten others into silence. None of this points to Emily Dawson. Instead, it paints a damning picture of corruption within Innovatech and places responsibility squarely on Laura Hayes. Kai turned toward the jury, her expression earnest. Fraud cases often rely on circumstantial evidence, but here, we have direct proof. Proof that shows my client is a victim, not a perpetrator. Emily trusted her employer and followed the rules diligently. She deserves justice, not punishment for crimes she didn't commit. Her final words echoed through the courtroom, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. As Kai returned to her seat, Emily reached out to squeeze her hand, tears streaming down her face. You did it, she whispered hoarsely. You saved me. Brian Carter rose to deliver his rebuttal, but his usual confidence seemed diminished. He reiterated the prosecution's key points, emphasizing the need to hold Emily accountable based on the initial evidence. However, his arguments felt weaker now, overshadowed by Kai's compelling presentation. When both sides finished, Judge Miller addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now your duty to weigh the evidence and reach a verdict. Please remember that guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Deliberations will begin tomorrow morning. As the session ended, the courtroom erupted into quiet conversations. Reporters surrounded Kai, eager for comments, but she declined to speak, focusing instead on preparing for the final outcome. Back in her office, she reviewed the day's events, replaying key moments in her mind. She knew the jury's decision would determine everything, but she also knew she had done everything possible to secure justice for Emily. That evening, Kai reflected on the journey so far. What had started as a daunting challenge had transformed, into a fight for truth and fairness. Every obstacle, every setback had only strengthened her resolve. And while the verdict remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Kai Trump had proven herself to be not just a skilled lawyer, but a relentless advocate for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The second day of the trial began with a somber atmosphere. The courtroom was quieter than the previous day, as if everyone knew the stakes were rising. Judge Harold Miller entered the room with his usual briskness, his robes swishing behind him. He took his seat and glanced at the clock before addressing the room. "Let's get started," he said gruffly, signaling for Brian Carter to call his next witness. Brian stood up confidently, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he made his way to the podium. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Laura Hayes to the stand," he announced. Laura Hayes, the head of operations at Innovatech, walked into the courtroom with an air of authority. Dressed in a sleek black suit, she carried herself with precision, her sharp features giving her an almost intimidating presence. As she swore to tell the truth, Kai Trump watched her closely, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read between the lines. Once seated, Brian began his questioning. "Ms. Hayes, can you describe your role at Innovatech and your relationship with Emily Dawson?" he asked, his tone smooth and professional. Laura nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I oversee all operational activities at the company. Emily Dawson reports directly to me as the CFO. We work closely together on financial matters." Brian nodded, walking slowly toward the jury box. "And during your time working with Ms. Dawson, did you notice anything unusual about her behavior or actions?" Laura hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes. Over the past year, I observed irregularities in our financial reports. These irregularities coincided with Emily's handling of certain accounts." She spoke with conviction, her voice steady and measured. "At first I thought it might be an oversight, but as the anomalies grew, it became clear that something more deliberate was happening." Brian paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. "Did you confront Emily about these irregularities?" "Yes, multiple times," Laura replied. "But she always dismissed my concerns, claiming they were clerical errors or minor discrepancies that would resolve themselves." Brian turned to the jury, his expression serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just negligence, it's deception, and it points directly to Emily Dawson." He turned back to Laura. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. No further questions." As Brian returned to his seat, Kai Trump stood up, her movements calm but deliberate. She approached the podium, her gaze fixed firmly on Laura Hayes. "Ms. Hayes," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you mentioned noticing irregularities in the financial reports. Can you explain what those irregularities were?" Laura adjusted in her seat, her composure unwavering. "There were unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts and discrepancies in revenue projections." Kai nodded, jotting something down on her notepad. "Unauthorized transfers? That sounds serious. Did you report these findings to anyone else in the company?" "I brought them up in meetings with senior management," Laura said, "but no concrete action was taken." "Interesting," Kai murmured, glancing briefly at the jury. "So, despite your concerns, nothing changed within the company?" "That's correct." Kai leaned slightly on the podium, her expression thoughtful. "Ms. Hayes, how familiar are you with Innovatech's accounting software?" Laura raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the question. "I'm not an expert, but I understand its basic functions." Kai smiled faintly. "Basic functions. So, you wouldn't say you're highly proficient in using the system?" "No, I wouldn't," Laura admitted reluctantly. "And yet," Kai continued, "you claim to have identified these so-called irregularities yourself, without consulting IT specialists or external auditors." Laura shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I relied on my experience and knowledge of the company's finances." Kai nodded again, her tone remaining polite but probing. "Fair enough. Now, Ms. Hayes, you mentioned confronting Emily Dawson about these issues. Did you document any of those conversations? Emails, memos, or notes?" Laura hesitated, her confidence wavering slightly. "Not formally, no. They were verbal exchanges. So there's no record of these discussions? No. Kai let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the jury to absorb the implications. Ms. Hayes, isn't it true that you had access to the same systems Emily did? That you could make changes or even create discrepancies without leaving a trace? Laura's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. That's a baseless accusation. Is it? Kai countered gently. You've admitted that you didn't consult experts when identifying these irregularities. You also didn't document your interactions with Emily. And now we learn that you have the same level of access to the company's systems as she does. Isn't it possible, Ms. Hayes, that someone else could have manipulated the data to frame Emily? The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Judge Miller banged his gavel sharply. Order, he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent once more. Laura straightened in her seat, her face flushed with anger. I assure you I had nothing to do with framing anyone. My only concern is protecting the integrity of Innovatech. Kai held up her hands in a gesture of peace. Of course. Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Hayes. No further questions? As Laura stepped down from the stand, her composure seemed rattled. Brian Carter watched her leave, his brow furrowed, in thought. He hadn't expected Kai to go after Laura so aggressively. Meanwhile, Judge Miller scribbled something on his notepad, his expression unreadable. The next witness called to the stand was Ryan Bennett, a mid-level accountant at Innovatech. Unlike Laura, Ryan appeared nervous, his hands fidgeting as he took the oath. Brian approached him cautiously, aware that this testimony could either strengthen or weaken the prosecution's case. Mr. Bennett, Brian began, can you describe your responsibilities at Innovatech? Ryan cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. I handled day-to-day accounting tasks, like reconciling accounts and processing payments. Brian nodded encouragingly. And in performing those duties, did you come across anything unusual recently? Ryan hesitated, glancing nervously at Laura, who sat stiffly in the gallery. Well, yes. There were some transactions that didn't seem right. What do you mean by didn't seem right? They were flagged as potential errors, but when I tried to investigate further, I was told to ignore them. Brian tilted his head, intrigued. Who told you to ignore them? Ryan swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. Ms. Hayes. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Miller looked up from his notes, his interest piqued. Brian pressed on. Did Ms. Hayes give you a reason for ignoring these transactions? She said they were being handled by higher-ups, Ryan replied, but I don't think that's true. Brian thanked Ryan and stepped back, allowing Kai to take the lead. Kai approached the podium with a reassuring smile, her demeanor calm and approachable. Mr. Bennett, thank you for your honesty. It must have been difficult to share that information. Ryan nodded weakly. It wasn't easy. I understand, Kai said softly. Now, Mr. Bennett, when you say you don't think Ms. Hayes was telling the truth, why is that? Ryan hesitated again, clearly torn between fear and the desire to speak freely. Finally, he sighed. Because I found evidence that suggested otherwise. Someone had altered the records to make it look like Emily was responsible for the discrepancies. Kai's eyes lit up slightly, though her expression remained composed. Evidence? What kind of evidence? There were metadata logs showing edits made to key files, Ryan explained. Those edits traced back to Ms. Hayes' login credentials. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Miller banged his gavel again, calling for order. Kai turned to Ryan, her voice gentle but firm. Why didn't you report this earlier? I was scared, Ryan admitted. Ms. Hayes has a lot of power at the company. If I spoke out, I didn't know what would happen to me. Kai nodded sympathetically. Thank you for having the courage to come forward today, Mr. Bennett. No further questions. As Ryan left the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. Brian Carter looked visibly frustrated, while Laura Hayes stared straight ahead, her face pale. Judge Miller leaned forward, studying both sides of the courtroom with growing curiosity. When the session ended for the day, Kai gathered her papers, her mind racing with possibilities. Emily approached her tentatively, her eyes filled with gratitude. Kai, I don't know how you did it, but you're amazing. Kai offered a small smile. We're making progress, Emily. But we're not done yet. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited eagerly, their cameras flashing as Kai walked past. She ignored them, focusing instead on the road ahead. Each day brought new challenges, but Kai felt a quiet determination building inside her. She wasn't just fighting for Emily anymore. She was uncovering the truth, a truth that others had tried desperately to hide. Back in her office, Kai reviewed the day's events, piecing together the puzzle. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, brought her closer to unraveling the web of deceit. And though the journey was far from over, one thing was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Kai Trump was proving to be more than just a lawyer. She was a force to be reckoned with. The final day of the trial began with an air of anticipation so thick it felt almost tangible. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with reporters jostling for space and spectators leaning forward in their seats, eager to hear the outcome. Judge I. Harold Miller entered the room, his usual stern expression softened slightly by curiosity. He took his seat and addressed the jury foreman. Have you reached a verdict? He asked. The foreman stood up, holding a slip of paper and trembling hands. We have, Your Honor. A collective hush fell over the room as everyone waited for the words that would decide Emily Dawson's fate. Kai Trump sat beside her client, her posture calm, but her heart racing. Emily clutched Kai's hand tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Please read the verdict, Judge Miller instructed. The foreman cleared his throat before speaking. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs. Emily burst into tears, covering her face with her hands as relief washed over her. Kai leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She had done it. Against all odds, she had secured justice for her client. Judge Miller banged his gavel sharply to restore order. Quiet, he barked. Once the room settled, he turned to Kai. Ms. Trump, I must say, your performance in this case has been impressive. You've certainly earned my respect. Kai nodded politely. Thank you, Your Honor. It's been a privilege to represent Emily and uncover the truth. Brian Carter looked visibly defeated, packing his files silently without meeting anyone's gaze. His confidence, once unshakable, had crumbled under the weight of Kai's relentless pursuit of justice. Laura Hayes sat frozen in her seat, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She knew what came next. As the formalities concluded, Judge Miller issued a warrant for Laura Hayes' arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. 2 officers approached her quietly, handcuffing her as whispers rippled through the gallery. Laura didn't resist, her composure shattered as she was led out of the courtroom. For the first time, the full weight of her actions, and the consequences, had caught up with her. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Kai and Emily, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Emily spoke first, her voice still shaky with emotion. I owe everything to Kai Trump. Without her, I wouldn't be standing here today. She believed in me when no one else did. Kai stepped forward, offering a small smile to the crowd. This case wasn't about winning. It was about finding the truth. Justice isn't always easy, but it's worth fighting for. I hope this serves as a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a chance to make things right. Her words resonated deeply, earning nods and murmurs of agreement from those gathered. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail of the young lawyer who had defied expectations and triumphed against all odds. Later that evening, Kai returned to her office, exhausted but satisfied. She replayed the events of the past, weak in her mind, reflecting on how far she'd come. What had started as a seemingly impossible challenge had become a defining moment in her career. Each obstacle, the skepticism, the pressure, the doubt, had pushed her to dig deeper and fight harder. And now, she could look back and see the impact of her efforts. Emily visited Kai later that night, bringing a small bouquet of flowers as a token of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said softly. "You saved my life." Kai accepted the flowers with a warm smile. "You're welcome, Emily. But remember, this victory belongs to you too. You stayed strong when it mattered most." Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." As Emily left, Kai sat down at her desk, staring at the flowers thoughtfully. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. Law wasn't just about arguing cases or winning trials. It was about giving a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. It was about seeking fairness in a world that often seemed unjust. The next morning, news outlets were abuzz with headlines about the trial. "Legal prodigy stuns courtroom" and "Young lawyer exposes corporate corruption" dominated social media feeds. Kai found herself at the center of attention, hailed as a rising star in the legal community. Offers poured in, job opportunities, speaking engagements, interviews, but she declined them all, choosing instead to focus on her work. Until the weeks that followed, Kai continued to take on challenging cases, each one testing her skills and resolve. Her reputation grew steadily, fueled by her dedication and unwavering commitment to justice. Clients sought her out, drawn by her ability to see beyond the surface and uncover hidden truths. Colleagues admired her tenacity, while opponents respected her sharp intellect. One afternoon, Judge Harold Miller stopped by her office unexpectedly. Kai greeted him warmly, surprised by the visit. "Your Honor, what brings you here?" she asked. Miller chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I wanted to personally commend you on your performance in the Dawson case. You reminded me of something. I sometimes forget that the law is more than rules and procedures. It's about people, about fairness, and you embody that perfectly." Kai blushed slightly at the praise. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot coming from you." Miller waved off her gratitude. "Keep doing what you're doing, Ms. Trump. This profession needs more people like you." As the judge left, Kai felt a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that her journey was only beginning. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight, but she was ready. Every case was an opportunity to make a difference, to stand up for those who needed help the most. Months later, Kai received a letter from Ryan Bennett, the accountant who had risked everything to testify against Laura Hayes. In it, he thanked her for believing in him and encouraged her to keep fighting for justice. "You've inspired me to be braver," he wrote. "Because of you, I know it's possible to stand up for what's right even when it's hard." Kai folded the letter carefully, tucking it into a drawer alongside other mementos from her cases. It was a reminder of why she did what she did. Not for recognition or accolades, but because someone had to. Because justice mattered. And so Kai Trump carried on, one case at a time. She faced each new challenge with the same determination and compassion that had defined her from the start. Her name became synonymous with integrity and excellence, inspiring others to follow in her footsteps. But for Kai, the greatest reward wasn't fame or success. It was knowing that she had made a difference. That somewhere, someone was living a better life because she had chosen to fight for them. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered.